Welcome to, I guess, the first KeyShot webinar of 2019. That's exciting. Well, what we're going to be doing is talking about KeyShotXR today in our webinar. And XR is not actually a new feature. It's been around for quite a while, but in my experience, it's one that a lot of people tend to forget that it exists, or maybe they're not quite sure what it is. So we're going to demystify that whole thing, and I'm going to show you kind of how to use these, how to make them, and hopefully show you ways that you can extend the use of KeyShot if you already have access to KeyShotXR. So we'll get things started. This is KeyShotXR, creating interactive renderings. My name is Will Gibbons. I'm the Global Training Specialist here at Luxion, the makers of KeyShot. And yeah, today I'm going to be taking you through XR. So before we begin, just to answer some common questions, this webinar is going to be recorded, and it will also be on YouTube later after the presentation, probably sometime next week, actually. As far as the computer that we're presenting on today, I'm using an old MacBook Pro 2015, so not particularly new hardware. It's got an i7 chip in it, so pretty standard. And again, we've mentioned this, but if you have questions, go ahead and type those into the questions box, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. So today's webinar is going to cover what a KeyShotXR is, making sure that you have a very good understanding of what it is, because with terms like VR and XR and AR and, you know, a lot of new acronyms around new technologies, well, we're going to make sure this is crystal clear so you know how to explain this to somebody and you know what this is too. We're also going to get into how we actually make XRs. So I'll take you through the different ways to execute the creation of an XR in KeyShot, and then how to get those out of KeyShot and what you do with them. And then that leads us into sharing XRs. So a lot of us are familiar with how to make a picture and share a picture, but we want to talk about how to share an XR once you create it, because it's a little bit different. Then we'll finish with a live demo. So I'll actually demonstrate how to make a couple of different XRs, well, the different processes within KeyShot. And then we'll have time for Q&A. Alrighty. So first step, what is an XR? Well, KeyShotXR is actually a form of interactive media that's experienced in either a web browser or on a tablet or some sort of a panel that you can interact with. That's pretty much it. So it does involve motion, so you can't per se print an XR like you can just a still image. But again, it is interactive, so you want some sort of way to input to however you're experiencing it, whether it's with a mouse on a computer or your finger on a display. So another thing is KeyShotXR is sold as an add-on product. So if you don't see the XR button in your KeyShot, your version of KeyShot, you can take a look at what it would take to get that installed. XR is basically included with KeyShot Enterprise licenses. So if you work at a larger corporation who has KeyShot Enterprise licenses, then you do have access to KeyShotXR. So what makes KeyShotXR actually interactive? Well, it's a media that responds to various kinds of input. And I sort of talked about this earlier, and sorry if this sounds abstract to begin with. We'll definitely demonstrate this later on. But examples of input, it could be clicking and dragging with a mouse. It could be scrolling across up or down a web page with your, with your mouse wheel. It could be swiping with your finger on a tablet, or pinch to zoom, that type of thing. So depending on how this XR is built, and whether or not you're experiencing on a computer or say a tablet, the way that the XR responds will be a little bit different. Again, if you click and drag, if you just swipe across like an iPad or something similar, then you could potentially tumble your object in 3D space. And of course, these are embeddable on websites, which is pretty cool too. So how does a KeyShotXR actually work behind the scenes? Well, an XR consists of two distinct files, really, or components. It has a folder of images, which we call frames. So if you are familiar with KeyShot animation, maybe you've you're familiar with the concept of rendering out a sequence of images, which we call frames, and when they're played in order, they create the illusion of motion. Well, this folder of images are going to be our frames for our XR. And then the second component is an HTML file. So this HTML file is something that tells the browser or the tablet or the device that you're experiencing this on how to interpret those frames and how to react to the input that you give it, whether, again, that's clicking and dragging with your mouse or swiping with your finger. The second thing I want to make sure that's very clear is that the HTML file is created along with the frames by KeyShot. So you don't actually have to know how to code or write anything, script or anything. What's really great is this is all done almost automatically for you. It's very simple. You'll see that this demo is actually not going to take terribly long. So we actually will have time to show you a couple different methods as well as take quite a few questions. So now when we talk about the uses or the use cases of XR, it's important to understand kind of what you could do with this, right? So a good example might be an exploded view for assembly instructions. There's a lot of times today where you want to figure out how to replace something or open something up or do maintenance on an object. This would be a great use case because a lot of us turn to videos when we're searching for how-tos, and this is like the next level of interactivity. You could essentially take a file and interact with it rather than just passively watching a video. So another idea that's pretty cool is that you could do cutaways. Thanks to KeyShot 8's new cutaway material, you could actually animate an object that has a cutaway material on it so that it actually allows you to scrub through and cut away a part, which is pretty cool. So another idea is product catalogs. A lot of us that's probably the go-to or the most obvious use case is people put these on their website. And that way you're not looking at one or two standard views. You can allow the user to look all the way around a product or view it from any angle they want. That's probably the most common use case. And then, of course, presentations. There's a lot of times where we take visuals from KeyShot and we use them in a presentation to gain buy-in or support for an idea or a concept, whether that's in a PowerPoint or I guess during a presentation where you want to kind of surprise somebody and show them, hey, wait, it's not just passive. You can click through and see all the sides of this object or see something in motion. And then, of course, dynamic web content. A nice example for this, I'll show you a little bit later, is actually how a Specialized Bicycle Company used a KeyShotXR as the landing page for their campaign when they launched the Venge bicycle a few years back. So they had it set up in such a way where on their home page it allowed you to experience this bicycle and instead of just watching a video, and it was really cool. So there's a few ideas, and I'm sure there are other ideas that go even beyond this. So of course, the reason you're here is to find out how to create KeyShotXR. So this is really the focus here. The two main methods for creating an XR is that we can use the KeyShotXR wizard, which is going to kind of walk us through step by step within the KeyShot user interface. The other method is that once you create an animation, whether it's intended to be rendered out as a video or for an XR, once you've built an animation within the KeyShot animation timeline, you can actually export that as XR content. So you can actually take an animation and turn it into something that's a bit more interactive than an animation. And I'll show you exactly how that works. And then, of course, to kind of bring this full circle, you want to understand how we can actually share these XR files. So the way we do this is that the XR files are going to be the folder of frames as well as the HTML file. So what would happen is you can double click on the HTML file if you're on a computer, and then it will launch in a web browser. And you don't need an internet connection for this per se, because the files are stored on your machine. It just uses the web browser to view and allow you to interact with the XR, just like you don't need, like if you open a video, there's like a video player on your computer, that type of thing. And then of course you can experience this on a tablet. And one way to do this is that you can use an application called iBooks. iBooks Author allows you to create these, books that are meant to be used on a tablet. Well, if you create an iBook using the iBooks Author, you can use the widget that KeyShot will also create for you if you like, and that can just be dragged right into iBooks Author or an iBook, and that way you can create almost like a digital brochure or a catalog that when somebody interacts with it on, say, an iPad or something, they can then view those XRs within that tablet environment. So another way to do this is to actually host that file of frames, or the folder of frames, on your website or on the server that hosts your website. And then somebody can interact with or view those XRs in real time on your website. And we have examples of this on our website, KeyShot.com. And that gives you a few examples of how they work and how long they take to load and things like that. And then, of course, you could host these on, say, an internal server, one where maybe it's not public facing, but maybe it's used for vendors and other clients, and you could give them access to it and send them a link that they can click. So the two main options of delivery is either send the batch of images or the folder of images or frames along with the HTML to the person you want to be able to interact with it, or you can just host them on a site or a server and then send the recipient a link. And you just need to make sure they have permission to access wherever those items are being hosted, basically. So hopefully that's clear. Again, if this sounds abstract, it should come together once we show you actually how to create these. And that's what we're going to do next. Before I jump into the demo, I'm going to double check. I'm going to check in with Rex and make sure there's no issues or main pressing questions or anything I've skipped out on before I jump into the demo. All right, very good. We'll get to it. We're going to pop into KeyShot here. So I'm running KeyShot 8.1 and 8.1 Pro. And again, I did mention this, that KeyShotXR is an extension or an add-on. So you may see an icon for it down in the toolbar at the bottom of your KeyShot user interface. And if it's grayed out, it does mean that your license does not include that feature. If you are interested, again, we've got more information we can follow up with on our website. I think keyshot.com/buy might have some info there. So now that I'm in KeyShot, I'm going to actually import a model, and we're just going to start from scratch. You know what? I might have jumped the gun. I am going to demo this for you, but let's actually start off with some examples so you can see where we're going before I create these examples for you. So I'm going to show you a few cool examples here. So remember when I mentioned we have a folder of frames as well as an HTML file? Well, this is what we're looking at here. This one called bottle with label. It's got a HTML file, and when I double click on that HTML file, we should see it launches in the browser. I use Chrome. And then if I click and drag, you'll see that this is interactive. So I'm actually moving the bottle around, or I guess in this case our camera, and you can see what I really like about this is it's not so much about showing off the form of the shampoo bottle, because most of us know what a shampoo bottle looks like and feels like. What this does, which is really cool, is it actually proves the case for this type of a label, and it really shows how having a matte or a kind of a satin finish label with some kind of chrome or metallic areas really pops off. And this kind of mimics what would happen when you walk by in a retail environment. You're walking by in the aisle and you see the light reflect off of it. So this kind of proves out a nice use case for someone working in packaging design or something like that. So it's very simple. It doesn't need to do much more than move a little bit left to right, but it does a good job of what it was made to do. So here's another example. If I go into this jet engine, this one's going to be a lot more complex. And you see there was a loading KeyShot icon in the upper left-hand corner. It took a few seconds to load. Well, this is a much bigger file. And you'll actually notice if I scroll with my mouse wheel, we can zoom in on it. So there's a couple cool ways we can do that, and I'll talk about how you set that up. This one's quite a bit larger, and it also appears pretty large in screen because I do have my display set to 1080p right now. But again, when I start to move around here, you can see I'm not confined to just left or right and up and down. I can do a true 360-degree tumble in every direction here. So this really allows somebody to kind of reference this part and really look at all of its little details, which is really cool. Now, I did mention cutaways earlier, and just to clarify, because I realized this is a cutaway, this was actually created quite a while ago, and it was done long before the cutaway feature was part of KeyShot. So this was actually modeled as a cutaway, and then this model was brought into KeyShot. But yeah, I can talk a little bit more about that later if anyone's interested. The other thing I want to show you here. I mentioned that loading symbol, that KeyShot loading symbol, because people will probably ask about that. Yes, you can replace that with your own logo. So here's another use case which is quite different from the one I just showed you. This other one of the engine is very engineering focused, and you could see this being used for either documentation or educational purposes. Well, something like this is almost like, well, it is a character sculpt or something similar, where this does a good job of kind of allowing somebody to look and maybe approve this artwork or this concept for a character before the art department moves forward with it. And you can see they've also restricted the movement because there's really no reason you'd need to look at the top of the head further or look up into the object from down below. And if I click and drag and let go, it'll spin on its own for a little bit and it comes to a rest. So it's pretty cool. It's got some nice natural movement when you interact with it. We also have something interesting here. So I did mention that an animation can be exported as a KeyShotXR, and this is a wonderful example of that. When I click and drag, the object doesn't move as you might have expected, the engine, but instead what happens is the engine animates. So the camera's staying put in this example, but the animation, which I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure this was animated in Creo. I think this might have been imported as a Creo mechanism. I'm sorry, the mechanisms within the Creo file were imported as an animation. And then in this case, you've got a very complex movement that's captured here. But again, this could be used for educational purposes or something like that. We also have, show you this guy right here. So this is a very simple, this is probably a little bit more typical to what people tend to use XR for, and it's just a simple 360 view. It doesn't allow me to rotate tumble up and down or anything like that. It's just a simple way to show off and give your audience a way to interact with a product that you might host on your website. A couple more quick examples and then we'll get into it. So in this case here, we have a simple kind of a handheld coffee grinder, but in this case the animation that was done was built as a typical KeyShot animation, and then scrubbing through actually takes us through that whole animation. And so if you click and drag, you can go faster or slower, forward or back. And then the other thing is, let's say you want to examine something. If you allow someone to zoom in, by allowing them to scroll, they can zoom into the product, get a lot closer. So again, there's different ways, things and features we can build into our XRs. And I want to show this last one because I do think this is probably the most impressive example here, this Venge. So I did mention Specialized used at KeyShotXR to create a cool interactive landing page when they launched their bicycle. This is what it looked like. So once we're sitting on the website, as you click and drag, kind of camera moves in, brings the user in close, and we see this cool exploded view. Reassembles itself, and look at that. You even have parts moving around and kind of disappearing after they show, oh, this stem also allows you to put a bike computer on there, a mount and everything. We got the water bottles that move and then disappear. All those nice little juicy details. And then we kind of pull back for that kind of final shot, which is really cool. And it'll scrub forward and backward and as fast or slow as you want. Really well done. Okay, so now that we've set the stage for kind of what this KeyShotXR is capable of, I want to get into actually creating something and showing you how to do that. So I am going to be using the same file that was used in that little example I showed you just a second ago. So we've got a typical 3D CAD file. I'm not going to do anything too crazy here. I'm going to turn off separate materials by part just because I would rather not have that there. And then, you know, pretty much all the default settings are going to be fine for this case. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to get too into material creation or assignment because those are covered in other webinars. Really, the purpose here is to show you just how to do the motion and the creation of a KeyShotXR. And we'll talk about render settings and export and render time and all that good stuff that comes along with this. Taking a little while to import, actually not quite sure. It may be because I'm running a whole bunch of other processes at this point, but sorry for that delay. Okay, so now we're in. We've got our basic diffuse materials, nothing custom going on in this KeyShot file or scene. And the only thing I'm really going to do is I'm going to go to my environment. I prefer to use this 3-panel straight 4K environment for a little bit better contrast and even lighting. And I'll hit C on the keyboard just to go to a white background. And in fact, I'm actually going to change my mind because I realize if we're moving our camera around, it's kind of hard to see what's happening with the background or the HDRI in relation to this product. So I'm actually going to instead use a different HDRI that has a bit more context so I can see whether the background's moving or not, or the HDRI is moving. Okay, so I mentioned there were two main ways to go about creating XRs. We can go about creating an animation, and we do cover how to make animations in KeyShot on other webinars, but let's say we had already created an animation here. Then once we were done, we would actually go into our render settings. And actually what I'll do is I'll actually just have a very simple animation here because if I don't, we won't actually be able to look at the XR render settings. So this is a turntable where my product just spins around its central axis. And yes, it seems off axis because it's spinning around the center of the bounding box of this entire model. But if I were to go to my render tab, we see across the top here, we have a few different categories. The way I like to explain this is that on the left you have all your options where you tell KeyShot kind of how to render your image and what quality and everything. Across the top here we have different kinds of media that we can output. So we can do a typical still image, which is what most people are familiar with. We can do an animation. And this tab will only be clickable if you actually have an animation in your timeline. And then now this gives us all the options to export, say, an animation or a video file. KeyShotXR, once again, will allow you to click on this. Actually, you may not need an animation in here, but nonetheless, this is where you would go to dial in all your render settings for this XR. And if I have my animation built in here, and I go ahead and run through all my KeyShotXR render settings, it will use, or it can use this animation for the type of motion that will be created in the XR file. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but just wanted to plant that seed so you know kind of where that's going. I'm going to hide this animation for timeline for now. And what I want to do now is kind of actually talk about what happens within this KeyShotXR wizard. So when you click on this button here on the right of the animation button, you get something called a KeyShotXR wizard. So the idea of an XR wizard is just to walk you through how to create this from the ground up. And we do a little, give you a little explanation of what a KeyShotXR is, and then we go straight to asking you which type of XR you actually want to create. You could create, say, a turntable, which is really no different than that turntable animation I just put in there. And this gives you a good preview of what this would look like or what type of motion you would get after rendering this out. When you go to spherical, you'll see this gives you the ability to move your camera or take the object and kind of rotate it in pretty much any direction. Hemispherical is kind of where it has restricted range of motion, so you can only kind of move left to right, and you can move up and down a little bit, but you can't go all the way over the top or bottom, and I'll show you what that looks like. The next option is tumbled. This is completely unlocked. So what that means is this would allow you to rotate your point of view or either your camera or the model, depending on how you look at it, all the way around in every direction without stopping. You would never run into a wall, or you would never have restricted degrees of freedom, as it were. Custom, you can actually go in here and you can really set up anything that you can think of. You get to define how much you can spin in any one direction on a vertical axis as well as a horizontal axis. And finally, animation. When you click on this, it is not going to use any of the above options, but it will refer to the animation you have created in the animation timeline, like I already have, as that path of motion. So if I were to hit next here, the next options it gives us is that we can now set up our camera. So if we wanted our camera to be closer or further away, you see this jumps all the way into 100. If I pull it back out to about 700, you'll see there that's a bit more of a realistic distance from my object, but we could dial this in as closely as we needed to. Our azimuth, this is going to move our camera around our object as a kind of an orbit, in an orbit fashion. And then inclination or elevation kind of tilts our camera up or down. And then perspective, of course, is going to either add or remove distortion, and give us a number that will hopefully, looks like my distance got super messed up. I'll go fix that. I may have to go back. Let's go fix this. I don't know why my camera really didn't like that. Let's go ahead and set this distance here. Okay, that was a little odd. I'm going to get back into my KeyShotXR wizard. Okay. And anyway, the point of this was to show that you have your camera controls here. So you can really set up how your camera looks. And then this grid is just for visual kind of cue, or allow you to kind of help with your composition and everything. And then when you hit next, it's going to ask how many frames. And again, because I'm currently on the animation option, it is going to look at the number of frames per second and the total number of seconds I have. So 30 times 5 is 150. And that's going to determine the smoothness of how this plays. So we could, if we didn't need it that smooth, but we wanted it to render faster, and thus render fewer frames, we could reduce our frames per second, or the number of frames here that we wanted to render out. We could also define the full animation or just a work area. Let's say we have a very complex animation and we just want to do a portion, like 1 second of this animation where it explodes. You could drag your these little flags, which is this denotes the work area between the crosshatch section. So you could define that and just render out a section of your animation, which would be really cool. And then looping, of course, allows you to, when it gets to the end, it will go back to the beginning. Whereas if we uncheck that, you can only play forward to the end or backward to the beginning. And then you would go to next, and you see it gives us our output options. This is where we go and define all of our rendering settings. We're not ready to talk about that yet, but I just wanted to show you what happens if you go all the way through the KeyShotXR wizard once you've created an animation. Cool. Take a pause for a second because I threw a lot of information at you there. But the next thing I want to do is actually talk about, let's say we don't have an animation. We just want to create a KeyShotXR from scratch. That is probably going to be the most common scenario, so I want to make sure you understand that. So if we were to rotate around the environment center, what that's going to do Okay, we're going to leave our camera settings right where they're at and hit next. You'll see this little yellow, or that's blue box that says KeyShotXR preview. This is now allowing me to click and drag, and I'm getting a kind of a real-time representation of what this is going to look like when I render this out. And you see it's kind of jerking or jumping. It's not a smooth path of motion. This is actually, the smoothness is controlled by how many frames we render out. So at 18 frames, that means it's dividing our 360-degree circle into 18 chunks or increments of 20 degrees. So it's 20 degrees between each frame here. The higher this number goes, the smoother that motion will get. And if we go really high, so 360, you should see it moves nice and smooth. Now, fair warning, this will render out 360 renderings. So you do need to be a little bit mindful of how many frames you think you actually need to give somebody the experience you're trying to deliver. So if I go ahead and hit back, what I want to show you next is if we were to change the rotation center, so the way that this object is going to rotate to something like object, we'll get a slightly different result. And the reason we'll get a slightly different result is because this object is asymmetrical. You'll notice this has a long arm that sticks out, and if we were to draw a bounding box around this entire product, the center point of that bounding box would fall somewhere right around where my cursor is, and it would rotate around this point. So if we did this to the viewer, it would look like the whole product is kind of rotating off axis. So that's something to be mindful of. Now, there are plenty of scenarios in which this is the desired behavior, but again, just something to consider. I'll bring my frames down to something like 50. All right, so the next option we have is panoramic camera. I'm not actually going to click on that for this demo because it's just going to make our object kind of disappear from frame. The reason for that is this is usually used when rendering out interiors. So let's say you have a space, like a retail space or an interior that you've rendered, and you want to give somebody the ability to look around within this space through a KeyShotXR. You would click on panoramic camera. That puts our camera kind of in the middle of our scene or wherever our camera's set up, and it allows you to kind of look around in all the different directions from that location. All right, so next is the camera target. Now, camera target, you can actually change or, you can set your camera target by right-clicking on a part and saying set camera target, and you'll notice this now becomes the middle of my KeyShot frame. That's fine. I can still center my product or bring my object back into view, but if I go ahead and choose camera target, now that becomes the location that we're rotating around. See how that works? Excellent. So finally we have custom, and this could allow me to say I want to rotate around the very, very center of this handle. I could go into the handle and choose the, within the handle arm, I could choose the handle arm, this piece here, and hit next. Again, I could pull my camera distance further away. And once I hit next, you can see now we're rotating perfectly around that. And the reason that's important is this object is staying put and everything else is kind of moving around it. So by going through those options, hopefully it's become fairly clear that you've got a lot of ways to control and set up a KeyShotXR. That was all just for the turntable option. When we go into spherical, you'll see that it gives you a lot more degrees of freedom in so much that you can move up and down and left and right. So if I hit next, again to preview this, you can see before we had just horizontal frames, we now have vertical frames. So we can go left to right. We can also go up and down. We can't go all the way over or under the top or bottom, but we can go up and down and left and right. Now, when we go to render this out, again, a little bit of a warning, we are going to do 18 renderings or frames horizontally, 9 vertically. This is going to result in 162 images because we multiply these together. That's how we capture every point around this we basically re-render that or pre-render this out. So somebody is able to view this from every angle. We give them that option while still getting a nice KeyShot quality image. So I'm going to go ahead and hit back again, and you'll see that we have a lot of the same options here. In fact, these same options. We have environment, object, panoramic camera, camera target, and custom. We have the same rotation center options as we did when we were looking at just doing a turntable. So we don't need to walk through these again, but each one of these will kind of specifically relate to the spherical rotational option. The one that I think will be different is if I actually, the one thing I wanted to call out was horizontal environment rotation. If you check that box, hit next, what should happen is that your environment should be rotating with this, the movement, like with your camera, I guess, or the object in this case. But if we turn that off, the type of behavior we should get is that the environment stays put while the object moves around. I know earlier when I was demoing this, you saw the background move a little bit. I think that's just a symptom of the preview. I'm quite sure that when you render this out, the environment would stay put and just your object will rotate within that, from within that environment. So as I back out of here, we see we had our turntable, our spherical. Hemispherical, again, is just going to prevent us from going all the way up to the top and all the way down to the bottom. So it's a much more restricted range of motion. Tumble is going to give us 0 restrictions. So if I hit next, and I hit next, you can see here, we can go all the way over the top and to the bottom, and it looks like you're kind of Sandra Bullock in Gravity. So you're kind of moving in every direction here. So if we go back, I want to call something out here. Custom, this is interesting because if turntable, spherical, hemispherical, or tumble do not match the exact thing that you need it to do, the custom option is a great way to go. Because at this point, what we can do is we can go ahead and you'll see here, we have something called angle control. By taking these numbers and reducing them, we're going to limit the directions that it will go. Or sorry, how far it will go. So I took my horizontal angle end and begin, and I moved them together. So we can only move left to right however many degrees, the difference between this number and this number. So this is a small left to right amount of movement, but currently I can go all the way up to the top and all the way to the bottom. If we go ahead and reduce these even further, you can kind of restrict and just give somebody this very kind of narrow degree of movement. So imagine that shampoo bottle we looked at in the beginning. This would make a lot of sense for, again, if you want someone to have an understanding of how light reflects across a surface or a specific material, this would be a good option. And you could do a very high frame count, so it'd be very smooth. And then when they click and move, it almost looks like, almost, I don't want to say like a video game, but like you're moving around an object in a very fluid way. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and back up here. So we went through all these, and again, I showed this earlier, but the very first, that grayed out option at the bottom, that animation, the reason it's gray now is because I deleted that animation, and there is none in our animation timeline now, so we can't choose that option. But okay, so now that we're clear on all these different ways we can create an XR and these different options, I'm going to choose a fairly simple, I'm going to choose tumble. I'm going to go ahead and have this rotate around its environment, and I'm going to leave my camera where it's at, and I'm going to do a very small amount of frames. We'll just do 6 horizontal and 6 vertical, and that would result in 36 images. And I'm going to hit next, and this takes us right into our render settings here, or our output options. So you see this is pretty simple. We can just name this, tell it the folder it's going to render out to, that's your animations folder, and we give it a viewing resolution or a size. And then, of course, our loading icon, we could replace this with something else if we wanted to, and maybe make it bigger or smaller. Now, if I click on render options, this takes us into our regular render options that we're all familiar with. So if I wanted to go into here and set my my sample setting, I could say, you know, this is for an XR. I don't want it to take too long. I could maybe say 64 samples is plenty. And I could go ahead and set the type of image or the format. So currently it'll render a JPEG. And PNG is the only other option. You would only do PNG if you really want the highest quality images possible, or if you want transparency. An alpha channel could be used there. Again, just depends on the use case. You know, if you are going to put this on a fancy website where you've got a background color that you want to show through in the background, alpha channel might make sense. JPEG is usually going to be good though for us. Again, viewing resolution, that's going to be the overall size of the image. Now, file size. This is a handy little slider because we might make a lot of images for this XR. We might not want them to take up too much space. So we have a file size slider. This is going to compress those images. If you're real tech savvy, you may prefer to do this after the fact using a script. There's a lot of tools that can batch process a bunch of images, and you could, of course, start with a high quality PNG to start with no compression, render out your frames, and then if you really wanted a little 2-for-1 there, you could actually take the frames that render out to a folder, you could encode those into an animation, and then you could also take those images and then you could batch process those down into something like a lightweight compressed JPEG, and that could be used as your XR, which you know, that's a nice way to get a 2-for-1 if you're going to spend the time to render out an entire we'll say an animation as an XR. Okay, so back to our standard options. We're going to likely render out a JPEG. This checkbox here allows us to create an iBook widget. That's all you need to check, and then KeyShot will make an iBook widget which could be used with iBook's author to create, again, an interactive experience with something like a tablet or an iPad. Inside here, we've got all these excellent options to really dial this in. This XR control is really just reiterating the things that we set up with the animation, or sorry, the XR wizard. So we wouldn't want to change those after the fact, but we could here if we really needed to. The other option we have is advanced, and this is cool because rotation damping, this is going to control how long it takes the model to stop spinning once you kind of let go of your mouse or after swiping the screen of a display. Mouse sensitivity, of course, will speed up or slow down that path of motion. This is an important one here, zoom in. So one of those examples I showed you, or a couple of them, you could scroll to zoom in and view the object or the animation closer, or the XR, I should say. This is great, and you can set how far you want to allow them to, the viewer to be able to zoom in. One thing I want to call out though, preserve image quality is checked by default. What this does is, let's say I'm rendering a 1920 by 1080 image. If I were to, so if my resolution here was, we'll just call it 1000. I guess 1920 by 1080, that's going to be more like 2000. But if we were to render this out and we left the zoom in checked for 200%, and we left the preserve image quality checkbox, it's actually going to render out a 4K or 4000 by 2700 pixel image for every frame. So just know that if you have preserve image quality on, if that's a must, it will absolutely effectively multiply the resolution of your XR and all those frames by this percentage. So just something to be aware of if you're concerned about render time or file size. Download on interaction is an option that allows the frames to load on the website page once somebody clicks and drags. So that helps with load times of web pages. Allow full screen mode by double click. It's pretty self-explanatory. You can put a different logo in there. You can deploy to an FTP, so you can have this render and then also when it's done, push to a server somewhere if you need to. And last but not least, if you're doing heavy post-processing, layers and passes are made available for a KeyShotXR because you could essentially use these layers and passes to run some image editing in something like Photoshop, and then run a script that basically applies those actions to every frame and in the whole folder. But again, most users are not going to get into that level of detail or usership. And then of course we would hit render, or we could just add this to the queue. And in my queue, I now have my XR would render at 4000 by 2742 pixels with 36 frames at 64 samples using the max samples render mode. And last but not least, I might have said this, but if I didn't, just to be sure, the lighting tab, whatever our settings are in our lighting tab for our real-time render settings, these are going to dictate our actual render settings, because when we use max samples or max time, the real-time render settings here are actually what's controlling how KeyShot is processing this image. Whereas if you were using custom control, these would be the actual settings used to create the frames for your XR. So hopefully that's a good overview. It took a little longer than I thought, so we're almost at the end of the hour, but what I'm going to do now is just basically pause here, and we'll take some time for some Q&A. I have not been able to keep an eye on the questions, but it looks like there's a lot there, so I'll do my best to answer any questions you guys have. Right now I'll go ahead and give it to Rex and see if he'd like to bring up any good questions that came up.
Hey, Will, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, there were a couple questions that came up pretty often. Actually, the most recent one from Andrew Castro, I think, was a really good point. He wanted some reference of the parameters to make sure that something like the dampening was a value that he was happy with, and wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to render out the whole XR only to find that the setting wasn't what was ideal for him. So I mentioned that you can actually go into the HTML file after the XR has rendered, and you can have access to edit some of those options. So if you can just open that up and show what that would look like, that would be great.
I absolutely can. Good call. So sorry about that. I accidentally clicked on the wrong icon earlier. But if we look again back at this bottle example, kind of there is, this is damped basically 100%. So when I click and drag, it's not really moving. This may not be the best example. Let me use one that actually rotates kind of all the way around. I think let's go ahead. This was a nice lightweight example, this guy here. So this guy who's got this head here, and it moves a lot once I let go of the mouse. Maybe I don't want that. I can go ahead and open that HTML file, as you mentioned, using a, I guess any text editor that edits HTML files. I'm on a Mac, but this Text Wrangler app is quite nice for this. You can see the HTML file is very simple. There's not a lot of information going on in here, but what's cool is it makes it very easy to go in and edit. Of course, changing well, let's actually work on the damping here first. So there's two things. We got U mouse sensitivity, V mouse sensitivity, and then we also have rotation damping, I guess. So 0.960000. If I take this down to say 0.2, and I save it, make sure that saves. Yes, I did. I'm going to go ahead and reopen that. Now when I click and drag, you see it's barely moving at all. So the higher that number is, the more it's going to spin and rotate. I brought it down to 0.2, and it barely moves once I let go of my mouse. A few other things you could do in there, of course, is you could play around with these. You can change some of these parameters, but know that in some cases it's not completely editable. Like you could change the size that it loads as, but again, it's not going to magically, quote unquote, scale up that image with perfect KeyShot quality. It's just scaling pixels at that point. But again, if you have the interest to go in here and play with some of these, kind of this true and false stuff, this stuff can be changed. That's pretty easy after the fact. Yeah, so hopefully that answers some questions and gives you some insight as to how you could go in and tweak some of the settings after the fact.
Awesome. Yeah, actually, I think maybe we want to take a step back here and go back to the very beginning because we're getting some kind of more basic questions about how does someone know if they have KeyShot XR?
Sure. So again, I think if you were to look across the toolbar within your KeyShot user interface, so that's the thing at the bottom, you've got a bunch of different icons. And when you hover over, they become blue, and you should be able to click on them. I might need some help from you, Rex, but I think even if somebody doesn't actually have access to KeyShot XR, is the icon there or is it not?
Yes, if you do not have the add-on for KeyShot XR, the icon will be grayed out, so you won't be able to click on it.
Okay.
Yeah, so if that's the case, then you'll need to purchase KeyShot XR as an add-on. And I see somebody says they have KeyShot Enterprise, but don't have the KeyShot XR symbol in KeyShot 8 Pro. So you might want to reach out to support at Luxion there, and they can help you out with that.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then also, would you mind showing the text instructions that output with a KeyShot XR that shows the user how to embed on a website? I think that might be
Yeah.
helpful for people to see.
Yes. So to just for the sake of clarity, I removed that set of instructions from these examples, but there's one in here that has it still. I think it's the Venge. You get this thing called a web instructions. This is from this was originally rendered out in 2015, so it's actually getting a little bit old. We may have a slightly newer version of this web instructions, but again, it's a PDF, and when you open it, it gives you explanations to how to upload this to your website. It gives you a little bit of some code snippets that you can use, and it explains a little bit more about, in this case, iframe tags. And I believe the newer ones also have some slight instruction on using with iBooks widgets.
Yeah, the newer version is actually in the HTML file, so it would essentially be, yeah, the same thing as what you see when you open up that Venge HTML, for example, but it will also include instructions on that page to embed as an iframe, etc. And that's automatically output when you render any KeyShot XR, and it'll walk you through that process. And of course, we have the KeyShot 8 manual, which has some more instructions on how to use KeyShot XR. One of the other items that is covered in the manual is how to embed in a PowerPoint or a Keynote document. So there was a number of questions about that. If you can include a KeyShot XR in a presentation. And yeah, if you're interested in embedding in a PowerPoint or in a Keynote, you can do that and find instructions in the KeyShot 8 manual. Unfortunately, you cannot embed in a PDF.
That's a good point. Yes. Yep. Sure thing. Appreciate it. Yeah, so I guess if I can leave you with any final advice before going here, it's just do a quick test, find out how long one of your frames is going to take to render, and then keep that in mind. I try to keep my render settings as modest as I can when rendering out a KeyShot XR, and then you can do some quick math to find out how much longer it'll take, and then just consider if your camera is getting closer or further from the object and your actual model is bigger or smaller in the frame, that will affect the render time of each frame a little bit too. But on that note, thanks for attending today's webinar. For more online tutorials and content, you can go to youtube.com/KeyShot3D. You can also go ahead and check out our website. I think it's KeyShot.com/learning. Should give you quite a few options of content we've created in the past. So thanks again, and we'll see you again next month on another KeyShot webinar.